Dr. Sarah Martinez's coffee cup shattered against the clinic floor, the same sound her grandmother's teacup made the morning they found her dog poisoned in 1952. 70 years later, same helpless rage, same breaking porcelain, but this time the victim stood breathing before her. The German Shepherd didn't move, couldn't move, encased in a living armor of thousands of black ticks that pulsed like a second heartbeat. His amber eyes met hers through the horror, not pleading, not afraid, but trusting. Someone had done this deliberately, methodically, turning this noble creature into a walking nightmare. The name tag read Duke in faded letters, and underneath, "If found, call Marcus Chen." But Sarah's hands trembled too violently to dial. Outside, autumn rain hammered against the windows like it had the day her own dog died in her arms, and she realized with crushing certainty that she was looking at either a miracle or a murder in progress. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days, and neither had Marcus Chen's search. He pressed his face against the kitchen window of his modest 2-story home on Maple Street, watching water cascade down the glass like the tears his 8-year-old daughter Emma had cried herself to sleep with for the past 6 months. Duke had been gone that long, vanished without a trace from their fenced backyard while Marcus was debugging code at his home office and Emma was at school. "Daddy, did someone call about Duke?" Emma's voice carried the hollow hope that had replaced her once bright laughter. She clutched a worn, stuffed German Shepherd, a poor substitute for the real thing that had slept at the foot of her bed since she was 6. Her mother's car accident had shattered their world 2 years ago, but Duke had somehow pieced it back together, one patient day at a time. The dog had seemed to understand Emma's nightmares, her sudden fears of being alone, her need for something warm and alive to anchor her to safety. Marcus turned from the window, his software engineer's logical mind warring with a father's desperate heart. The missing dog posters he'd printed, 2,000 of them, had cost him 3 weeks' grocery money. The private investigator had taken another 1,000 before admitting defeat. His savings account, once healthy enough for Emma's college fund, now showed a balance that made him skip meals so she wouldn't have to. "Not yet, sweetheart," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "But you know Duke. He's smart. He's probably helping someone who needs him more than we do right now." The lie tasted bitter, but Emma's small smile made it worthwhile. Duke had arrived in their lives like a golden miracle during Marcus's darkest hour. Fresh from the animal shelter, barely 8 weeks old, the puppy had immediately claimed Emma as his personal responsibility. When thunderstorms sent her scrambling for covers, Duke materialized beside her bed. When she forgot her inhaler at school, Duke somehow sensed her panic and led Marcus straight to her classroom. The dog possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate trouble, to position himself between danger and the family he'd chosen to protect. The phone rang, jolting Marcus from his memories. His heart hammered against his ribs. After 6 months of silence, every call carried the weight of possibility and dread. Emma's eyes went wide with hope as he reached for the receiver. "Mr. Chen, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Riverside Animal Hospital." The woman's voice carried an odd mixture of urgency and careful control. "I believe we've found Duke." Marcus's knees nearly buckled. Emma pressed close, straining to hear. Is he okay?" A pause stretched long enough for Marcus to imagine every worst-case scenario. Then Dr. Martinez spoke again, her words measured and heavy. "He's alive, Mr. Chen. But you need to come now. And please prepare yourself. Someone has hurt him very badly." The rain outside seemed to pause, as if the whole world held its breath, waiting for what came next. The 20-minute drive to Riverside Animal Hospital felt like crossing decades. Marcus gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while Emma sat silent in the passenger seat, her stuffed German shepherd pressed against her chest like armor. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the October rain, and with each sweep, Marcus's mind conjured new horrors about what they might find. Dr. Sarah Martinez met them at the clinic's side entrance, her scrubs splattered with something dark that Marcus tried not to identify. She was younger than her voice had suggested, mid-40s, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that had seen too much suffering to maintain illusions about human kindness. "Before you see him," she said, blocking their path with gentle authority, "I need you to understand what we're dealing with. Duke has been systematically tortured. Someone covered him with thousands of ticks and left him to die slowly." Emma's sharp intake of breath cut through the antiseptic air. Marcus felt his world tilt sideways. Ticks? How many? Over 3,000. They've been feeding on him for weeks, maybe months. His blood count is dangerously low, and we're dealing with multiple tick-borne diseases. Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. "In 30 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen deliberate cruelty on this scale." She led them down a hallway lined with motivational posters about pet health that seemed obscenely cheerful given the circumstances. The examination room smelled of disinfectant and something underlying that Marcus's brain refused to process. In the center, on a steel table covered with surgical drapes, lay a shape that bore little resemblance to the golden dog who had once bounded through their lives like concentrated sunlight. Duke raised his head at their voices, that familiar triangular face now gaunt and hollow, his once bright amber eyes dulled with pain but unmistakably alert. The ticks covered him like a living black shroud, their engorged bodies creating a grotesque landscape across his back and sides. Some had grown to the size of grapes, others clustered around his ears and muzzle in writhing masses. "Oh, Duke," Emma whispered, and the broken sound of her voice made something die inside Marcus's chest. But Duke's tail moved, barely a flutter against the metal table, but movement nonetheless. Recognition, joy impossibly despite everything. The dog tried to stand and failed, his legs too weak to support even his diminished weight, but his eyes never left Emma's face. Marcus stepped forward on unsteady legs. "Who would do this? Why?" Sarah was already moving, pulling on surgical gloves with practiced efficiency. "That's what Detective Rodriguez wants to know. She's treating this as an intentional animal cruelty case, possibly connected to something larger." She hesitated, then reached into Duke's collar, withdrawing a small electronic device. "We found this GPS tracker. Someone wanted to monitor his suffering." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't random cruelty. This was personal. Someone had specifically targeted Duke, had planned this torture with methodical precision. Someone wanted Marcus to find his dog exactly like this, wanted him to witness the systematic destruction of the creature his daughter loved most in the world. "The removal process will take hours," Sarah continued, her hands already working to extract the largest ticks with surgical tweezers. "Some of these have burrowed so deep they've caused secondary infections. His system is compromised. Dehydration, anemia, possible kidney damage." She looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. "I won't lie to you. Even if we remove every tick, he might not survive." Emma moved closer to the table, ignoring her father's protective gesture. "Duke, it's me. We're here now." Her small hand hovered over his head, afraid to touch, but desperate to comfort. Duke's eyes tracked to her voice, and that ghost of a tail wag returned. "The treatment will be expensive," Sarah said quietly. "Emergency surgery, blood transfusions, weeks of intensive care. I'm talking about thousands of dollars, possibly tens of thousands. Marcus's throat constricted. His savings were already depleted from the search efforts. His credit cards were maxed. He could mortgage the house, but that would take time Duke didn't have. The cruel mathematics of love and money warred in his chest. How do you price a family member's life when you don't have the money to save them? "We'll figure it out," he said, though he had no idea how. "Just please save him." Sarah nodded, something in her expression shifting from professional sympathy to personal commitment. "I'll start the removal process immediately. The next few hours will tell us everything." She paused, one tick-covered glove poised in the air. "Mr. Chen, Duke's been through hell, but he's still fighting. That tells me everything I need to know about why someone wanted to hurt him. Dogs like this, they inspire love and loyalty that some people can't stand." As Sarah began the painstaking process of removing the ticks one by one, Marcus realized they weren't just fighting for Duke's life. They were fighting against whoever had done this, against the kind of evil that could torture innocence and call it justice. The tick removal became a meditation on horror. For 6 hours, Dr. Sarah Martinez worked with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint, extracting each parasite with surgical tweezers while Marcus held Duke's head and Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, reading aloud from Where the Red Fern Grows in a voice that trembled but never stopped. Detective Maria Rodriguez arrived during the 3rd hour, her weathered face grim as she documented the crime scene with methodical photographs. She was a 20-year veteran who'd seen domestic violence, child abuse, and drug-related murders. But something about Duke's condition made her jaw clench with barely contained rage. "This level of planning suggests personal motivation," she told Marcus during a brief break while Sarah administered another round of antibiotics. "Someone didn't just want to hurt an animal. They wanted to hurt your family specifically. Any enemies? Business disputes." "Angry neighbors?" Marcus shook his head, exhaustion making his thoughts sluggish. "I'm a software engineer. I work from home, keep to myself. The only controversy in my life was when Emma and I adopted Duke from the shelter instead of buying purebred." A terrible thought struck him. "You don't think someone at the shelter—" "We'll check everything," Rodriguez assured him. "But this feels more personal than professional. Someone's been watching your family, learning your routines. The GPS tracker suggests they wanted real-time updates on Duke's condition." By hour 4, Duke's vital signs had stabilized enough for Sarah to begin blood transfusions. The German Shepherd remained conscious throughout the ordeal, his amber eyes never leaving Emma's face as she read about Billy and his dogs in the Ozark Mountains. There was something transcendent about his endurance. No whimpering, no struggles, just absolute trust that these humans would make the pain stop. "He's remarkable," Sarah murmured as she removed a particularly large tick from behind Duke's ear. "Most animals in this condition would be catatonic from trauma. He's staying conscious for her." She nodded toward Emma, who had reached the part where old Dan and little Ann Tree, their first raccoon. The turning point came during hour 5, when Sarah discovered something that made her freeze mid-extraction. Embedded beneath a cluster of ticks on Duke's shoulder was a small puncture wound, perfectly round and clearly made by a needle. "Detective Rodriguez?" Sarah called urgently. "You need to see this." The detective leaned in, her trained eye immediately recognizing the significance. "Injection site. Recent, maybe a week old." Sarah carefully probed the area with a sterile instrument. "Whatever they injected, it's made him weak and compliant. Probably a sedative cocktail designed to keep him docile during the tick infestation." Her voice carried the cold fury of a professional who dedicated her life to healing. This wasn't just torture, it was calculated, scientific torture. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The person who'd done this possessed medical knowledge, access to veterinary-grade sedatives, and enough sophistication to plan a months-long campaign of suffering. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was the work of someone who understood exactly how much pain they were inflicting and had chosen to inflict it anyway. The injection explains his condition when we found him, Sarah continued. He was standing upright but couldn't run. They wanted him to be discovered like this, helpless but alive, maximum psychological impact. Emma looked up from her book, her 8-year-old mind processing implications that chilled Marcus to the bone. Someone wanted us to find Duke dying. They wanted us to watch? Before anyone could answer, Sarah's hands stilled over a particularly engorged tick near Duke's spine. There's something else. She used magnifying glasses to examine the parasite more closely. This tick has been marked. Detective Rodriguez leaned in with her evidence kit. The tick bore a tiny spot of blue paint on its back, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. They're numbered, Sarah breathed, checking several other ticks with growing horror. Someone marked specific ticks to track the progression of the infestation. They were conducting an experiment. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of medical equipment and Emma's quiet voice as she continued reading, determined to maintain normalcy in a situation that had become surreal with calculated evil. Duke's breathing remained steady, but Marcus could see the toll the revelation was taking on the dog's spirit. Even animals, it seemed, could sense when they'd been reduced to test subjects. "We need to expand this investigation," Rodriguez said, her phone already in her hand. "This level of sophistication suggests veterinary training, possibly academic research background, someone with access to laboratory equipment and controlled substances." Sarah's hands never stopped moving as she spoke, each tick removal bringing Duke incrementally closer to survival. The pattern of placement, the timing of the injections, even the choice of tick species, this person knows exactly what they're doing. They wanted to cause maximum suffering while keeping Duke alive long enough to be found. By hour 6, they'd removed over 2,000 ticks, and Duke's true condition began emerging like a photograph developing in solution. Beneath the parasites, his golden coat was patchy and thin, his ribs clearly visible through damaged skin. But his eyes had regained some of their brightness, and when Emma reached the climactic hunting scene in her book, Duke's tail managed a weak but unmistakable wag. "The worst is over," Sarah announced, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "We'll need to monitor him for disease symptoms, but his vital signs are improving." Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for hours finally escape. "Will he recover fully?" Sarah looked at Duke, who was now strong enough to lift his head toward Emma's voice. "Physically, probably. The psychological trauma." She paused, watching as Duke's eyes tracked to Marcus with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. "He's still trusting humans after what he's been through. That tells me his spirit isn't broken." Detective Rodriguez closed her evidence kit with a decisive snap. "Now we find the monster who did this." The next 72 hours transformed the quiet town of Riverside into something resembling a crime scene from a television drama. Detective Rodriguez had called in specialists from the state police, and Duke's story spread through the community like wildfire, igniting a fury that surprised even longtime residents who thought they'd seen everything small-town life could offer. Marcus barely left the animal hospital during Duke's critical first night. He dozed fitfully in a plastic chair beside the recovery kennel, startling awake every time Duke whimpered or shifted position. Emma had finally been persuaded to go home with her grandmother, but not before extracting a promise that she'd be called immediately if Duke's condition changed. Dr. Sarah Martinez worked in shifts with her associate, Dr. James Patterson, monitoring Duke's blood work and administering medications around the clock. The tick-borne diseases were manifesting predictably: Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and ehrlichiosis, but Duke's response to treatment was exceeding their most optimistic projections. "He's fighting like I've never seen," Sarah told Marcus during one of her brief breaks. Most dogs this compromised would have given up days ago. He's staying alive through pure will." By Wednesday morning, local news crews had arrived, drawn by social media posts that had turned Duke into an unlikely symbol of resilience. The hospital's parking lot filled with flowers, handmade cards from school children, and donations that poured in from strangers who'd been moved by the story. Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the kindness of people he'd never met, but also haunted by the knowledge that somewhere in this same community lived the person who'd orchestrated Duke's torture. Detective Rodriguez's investigation had yielded disturbing patterns. The GPS tracker had been purchased with cash from an electronics store in Portland, but security footage showed a figure in dark clothing and a baseball cap who'd deliberately avoided cameras. The veterinary sedatives found in Duke's system were controlled substances that required special licensing to obtain. "We're dealing with someone who has legitimate access to these drugs," Rodriguez explained to Marcus over coffee in the hospital's break room. "Veterinarian, veterinary technician, maybe a researcher at the university. Someone who knows animal physiology well enough to calculate dosages that would incapacitate without killing." The most chilling discovery came when Rodriguez traced the specific species of ticks found on Duke. They weren't native to Oregon. They'd been shipped from a biological supply company in North Carolina, ordered 6 months earlier and delivered to a post office box that had been rented under a false name. "This person has been planning Duke's torture since spring," Rodriguez said, her frustration evident. "They've been watching your family, learning your routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. 6 months ago? That was right around the time Emma started sleeping through the night again without nightmares. Duke had finally helped her feel safe after her mother's death. "Tell me about that period," Rodriguez pressed. "Any changes in your routine? New people in your lives? Anyone who might have observed Duke's importance to your family?" Marcus struggled to remember. The months following his wife's death had blurred together in a haze of grief and single parenthood. Duke had been their constant, the one source of stability when everything else felt uncertain. "There was the camping trip," he said slowly. "Last summer we went to Crater Lake. It was our first family vacation since Linda died. Duke came with us, obviously. Emma was finally ready to try sleeping in a tent again." Rodriguez leaned forward. "Anyone else at the campground? Any interactions with other families?" "Lots of people. It was peak season." Marcus closed his eyes, trying to visualize those sun-drenched days that had felt like the first real happiness they'd experienced in months. There was another family with a little boy, maybe 6 years old. Emma played with him a few times. His father seemed, I don't know, sad, like he was dealing with his own loss. "Do you remember their names?" Marcus shook his head. "The boy was named Timmy, I think. I never caught the father's name. They left suddenly, some kind of family emergency. The boy had gotten too close to the river, slipped on some rocks. Duke actually helped pull him back from the water, but the kid hit his head pretty hard. An ambulance came and we never saw them again." Rodriguez's expression sharpened. "Duke saved a child from drowning?" "Not drowning, exactly. The boy was in shallow water, but Duke seemed to sense danger. He grabbed the kid's shirt and pulled him toward shore. We thought Duke was being a hero." Marcus paused, a terrible possibility beginning to form. "You don't think?" "I think we need to find out what happened to that little boy," Rodriguez said grimly. The investigation into the camping incident revealed a tragedy that explained everything. Timothy Fletcher, age 6, had died 3 days after the accident, not from drowning, but from complications related to a traumatic brain injury sustained when he fell against the rocky riverbank. His father, Robert Fletcher, a 52-year-old construction foreman, had blamed himself for letting his son play unsupervised near the water. But grief had twisted Robert's memories. In the months following Timmy's death, he'd convinced himself that Duke had caused the accident rather than prevented a worse tragedy. Witnesses confirmed that Duke had actually pulled the boy away from deeper water, but Robert's shattered psyche had transformed the dog from savior to murderer. Survivor's guilt, explained Dr. Patricia Hensley, a trauma counselor Rodriguez had consulted. The father needed someone to blame besides himself. Duke became a convenient target, the dog who failed to protect his son completely. Rodriguez's team found Robert Fletcher living in a rundown apartment across town, his construction business dissolved, his savings depleted by medical bills and legal fees from a workers' compensation claim gone wrong. His descent into obsession with Duke had consumed 2 years of his life, during which he'd learned everything he could about animal suffering, acquired veterinary supplies through online black markets, and planned his revenge with methodical precision. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed journals documenting Duke's daily routines, photographs of the Chen family taken with telephoto lenses, and medical research about tick-borne diseases that read like a manual for torture. Robert had transformed his grief into a weapon, his love for his dead son into hatred for the dog he blamed for Timmy's death. Meanwhile, Duke's recovery accelerated beyond all medical expectations. By Friday, he was strong enough to stand for short periods, and his appetite had returned with a vengeance. Emma visited every day after school, reading to him from a growing collection of books donated by sympathetic community members. The bond between girl and dog seemed to grow stronger through the ordeal, as if shared trauma had created an even deeper connection. "It's remarkable," Sarah observed, watching Emma guide Duke through gentle physical therapy exercises. Most animals this traumatized would show fear responses, aggression, or withdrawal. Duke's actually more affectionate than before. Marcus understood. Duke had always been protective of their family, but now there was an almost mystical quality to his devotion. The dog seemed to recognize that he'd been targeted specifically because of his love for Emma, and rather than diminishing that love, the experience had purified it into something transcendent. The community response continued to overwhelm everyone involved. A local restaurant organized a fundraiser that raised $12,000 for Duke's medical expenses. Elementary school classes created a giant Get Well card covered with crayon drawings of German shepherds. The mayor announced plans for a ceremony honoring Duke's courage and the community's response to animal cruelty. But beneath the outpouring of support, Marcus struggled with a growing sense of dread. Robert Fletcher remained at large, and Rodriguez's attempts to locate him had been unsuccessful. His apartment had been abandoned. His car found parked at a bus station with tickets purchased for multiple destinations, a deliberate attempt to confuse investigators. "He's not finished," Rodriguez warned Marcus during one of their daily briefings. "Men like Fletcher don't just walk away from obsessions this deep. The fact that Duke survived his torture might actually escalate his need for revenge." Sarah had increased security at the animal hospital, installing new locks and arranging for staff to work in pairs. But she refused to transfer Duke to another facility, recognizing that separating him from his family during recovery could cause psychological damage. "We're not giving in to fear," she declared during a staff meeting that Marcus was invited to attend. "This hospital has always been a sanctuary for animals in need. We're not going to let one disturbed individual change that." The words were brave, but Marcus noticed the tremor in Sarah's hands as she spoke. Everyone was affected by the knowledge that somewhere in their peaceful community lurked someone capable of systematic torture, someone whose grief had metastasized into something monstrous. Emma seemed less affected by the adult fears swirling around her. She'd adapted to the hospital routine with the resilience of childhood, treating the staff room as her temporary homework space and the recovery ward as Duke's temporary bedroom. Her presence had a calming effect on other animals in the hospital, and Sarah had started joking that Emma might have a future as a veterinary therapist. But Marcus caught moments when Emma's facade slipped. When she thought no one was watching, her 8-year-old face would assume an expression of worry far too mature for her years. She was carrying burdens that no child should bear, and Marcus felt the familiar guilt of single parenthood, the knowledge that he couldn't protect his daughter from every source of pain in the world. Friday evening brought the breakthrough Rodriguez had been hoping for. A tip from a convenience store clerk led to surveillance footage showing Robert Fletcher purchasing camping supplies and gasoline, enough for an extended stay in the wilderness or for something more sinister. "He's planning something big," Rodriguez told Marcus as they watched the grainy security footage. "This isn't a man who's given up. This is a man who's preparing for a final confrontation." Saturday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt like a false promise, as if nature itself was holding its breath before the storm. Duke had progressed enough to take short walks around the hospital's fenced exercise yard, his golden coat beginning to show patches of healthy regrowth where the tick damage was healing. Emma sat cross-legged in the grass, watching him explore with the cautious enthusiasm of a survivor, learning to trust the world again. Marcus stood at the window of the recovery room, his phone pressed to his ear as Detective Rodriguez delivered the news he'd been dreading. "We found Robert Fletcher's campsite," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "He's been living in the woods about 15 miles northeast of town, near the old logging roads. Marcus, you need to hear this. We found detailed surveillance photos of Emma's school, your house, even the animal hospital. This man knows your every move." The phone felt heavy in Marcus's hand. Through the window, he watched his daughter teaching Duke to sit again, her patient voice carrying across the yard. "Good boy, Duke. Remember? Just like before. Good boy." The normalcy of the scene felt surreal against the backdrop of Rodriguez's words. "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "We found maps of the area with locations marked in red ink. The hospital, your neighborhood, Emma's school bus route. And Marcus, there were detailed floor plans of the animal hospital, hand-drawn, accurate down to the ventilation systems and emergency exits." A chill ran down Marcus's spine despite the warm morning air. How would he get building plans? That's what we're trying to figure out. Could be public records. Could be he's been inside the building. Dr. Martinez is checking her employment records, but we need to assume he has intimate knowledge of the hospital layout. Through the glass, Marcus watched Sarah approach Emma and Duke, carrying a small bag of training treats. Even from a distance, he could see the veterinarian's forced smile, the way her eyes constantly scanned the perimeter of the yard. Everyone was trying to maintain normalcy while terror lurked just beneath the surface. "We're moving you to a safe house," Rodriguez said. "All of you. Emma, Duke, when he's stable enough to travel, even Dr. Martinez if she's willing. This man has had 2 years to plan whatever he's planning, and we can't take chances." "What about Duke's treatment? He's not ready to leave intensive care." "We're working on that. There's a veterinary facility in Portland that specializes in trauma cases. They have security measures we can work with." Marcus watched Emma stand up, brushing grass from her jeans as Duke managed a few tentative steps toward her. The dog's tail wagged weakly, but his eyes were bright with something approaching his old alertness. Moving him now could undo weeks of careful recovery, but staying put might mean giving Robert Fletcher exactly what he wanted, a target he could reach. The decision was taken from Marcus's hands when Sarah burst through the hospital's back door, her face pale with alarm. "Marcus, get Emma inside now!" Detective Rodriguez's voice crackled through the phone. "What's happening? Marcus, talk to me!" Marcus ran toward his daughter, who was kneeling beside Duke in the middle of the yard. "Emma, come inside. Right now." But Duke was just starting to, "Now, sweetheart. Please." Sarah reached them first, her medical training overriding her fear as she quickly assessed Duke's condition. "He's fine, but we need to get everyone inside immediately." As they helped Duke to his feet, The dog instinctively staying close to Emma despite his obvious confusion, Sarah explained what had triggered her alarm. "One of our night technicians just called. Someone broke into the hospital's storage facility last night. They didn't take drugs or equipment, they took Duke's medical files." Rodriguez's voice was barely audible through the phone speaker. "Files? What kind of files?" "Everything," Sarah said, guiding Duke toward the hospital entrance with professional efficiency that couldn't quite hide her shaking hands. Treatment records, blood work, medication schedules, but most importantly, they took the x-rays that showed exactly how much damage the ticks had done internally. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Robert Fletcher now knew precisely which organs had been compromised, which medications Duke was receiving, how much stress his system could handle before complete failure. It was as if he'd obtained a medical blueprint for finishing what he'd started. Inside the hospital, the staff had transformed the building into something resembling a fortress. Additional locks had been installed overnight. Security cameras monitored every entrance, and 2 police officers were stationed in the parking lot. But Marcus knew that all the precautions in the world couldn't protect against someone who'd spent 2 years studying their routines with obsessive precision. Emma sensed the adult fear surrounding her, though she couldn't fully understand its source. She settled beside Duke's recovery kennel, her small hand resting on the dog's head as he lay panting from the exertion of their brief walk. "Is someone trying to hurt Duke again?" she asked with the direct honesty that children bring to impossible situations. Marcus knelt beside his daughter, struggling to find words that would be truthful without being terrifying. "There's a man who's very sad about something that happened to his little boy. He thinks Duke did something wrong, but he's confused because of how sad he is. Like when I blamed Duke for Mom's accident?" Emma's question cut through Marcus's heart. After Linda's death, Emma had briefly convinced herself that if Duke had been in the car, he could have somehow prevented the crash. It was a child's magical thinking, but it had taken months of gentle correction to help her understand that some tragedies are beyond anyone's control. "Exactly like that," Marcus said softly. "But this man is a grown-up, and he's making grown-up mistakes that can hurt people." Dr. Sarah approached with a clipboard and an expression of determined professionalism. "I've been in contact with the trauma facility in Portland. They can take Duke this afternoon if we decide to transfer him. It's not ideal medically, but it might be our safest option." Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. Detective Rodriguez's number flashed on the screen, but when he answered, a different voice spoke, rough, exhausted, carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of sleepless nights. "Mr. Chen, this is Robert Fletcher." The hospital's recovery room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment and Duke's gentle panting. Sarah's eyes went wide as she recognized the name, and she immediately began gesturing for the police officers in the lobby. "I think it's time we had a conversation," Robert continued, his voice carrying an odd mixture of exhaustion and determination. "About what really happened to my son. About what your dog really did that day." Marcus's hand trembled as he held the phone. "Mr. Fletcher, I'm not here to hurt your family," Robert interrupted, and something in his tone suggested he was telling the truth. "But I need you to understand something. I need you to see what I've seen, know what I've learned. Meet me at Crater Lake, at the same campsite where it happened. Come alone and bring the dog. He's not strong enough to travel. He almost died because of what I did to him." Robert's voice cracked slightly. "I know. I watched every moment of his suffering through that GPS tracker. I wanted him to die slowly, the way Timmy died slowly. But something's changed, Mr. Chen. Something I didn't expect." Sarah was now speaking urgently into her own phone, coordinating with Rodriguez and hospital security. Emma had moved closer to Duke, her child's instincts recognizing danger even if she couldn't name it. "What changed?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. I've been watching the news reports about your dog's recovery, reading the articles about how the community rallied around him, seeing the pictures of your daughter reading to him while he healed." Robert paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note Marcus hadn't expected, something that might have been regret. "My son loved dogs, Mr. Chen. Loved them more than anything in the world. The last thing he said to me before the accident was that he wanted to pet your dog, wanted to play with him." The words hung in the air like a bridge between two different versions of the truth. Marcus could hear Rodriguez's voice through Sarah's phone, coordinating search teams and roadblocks, but Robert's revelation had shifted something fundamental in the equation. "If you won't come to me," Robert continued, "then I'll come to you. And Mr. Chen, I'm not the only one who's been planning for this day. There are things you don't know about that camping trip, about what really happened to Timmy. Things that will change everything you think you understand about your dog." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone while Duke raised his head from the kennel, amber eyes alert despite his weakness. The dog was looking toward the hospital's front entrance, his nostrils flaring as if he'd caught a scent that carried memories of pain and fear. "He's coming here," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure how he knew. "Whatever Robert Fletcher has planned, it's happening today." Robert Fletcher arrived at Riverside Animal Hospital at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, walking through the front door like a man approaching his own execution. He carried no weapons, made no threats, simply stood in the lobby with his hands visible and asked the receptionist to call Marcus Chen. Detective Rodriguez's officers moved to intercept him, but Robert raised his hands slowly, his voice carrying the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd reached the end of a very long road. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said quietly. "I just need to finish this." Marcus found himself face to face with the man who'd tortured Duke for the first time, and the encounter was nothing like he'd imagined. Robert Fletcher looked like grief personified, thin to the point of gauntness, gray-haired despite being only 52, with eyes that held the particular emptiness that comes from losing a child. He wore a faded photograph of a little boy pinned to his shirt pocket, and his hands shook with what might have been withdrawal from whatever substances he'd been using to cope with his pain. "Mr. Chen," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to show you something." Detective Rodriguez positioned herself between the two men, her hand resting on her service weapon. "Mr. Fletcher, you're under arrest for animal cruelty, criminal harassment, and—" "I know what I've done," Robert interrupted, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "I know what I am. But before you take me away, I need him to see this." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small digital camera. "Video from the campground. Security footage that nobody else has seen." Sarah had brought Duke into the lobby on a medical gurney, the dog strong enough to lift his head but still too weak to stand for extended periods. When Duke saw Robert, his reaction was unexpected. Instead of fear or aggression, the German Shepherd's tail moved in what could only be described as recognition, not joy but acknowledgement, as if he understood that this moment had always been inevitable. "Show us," Marcus said, ignoring Rodriguez's warning gesture. Robert's hands trembled as he operated the camera, finding the file he needed. "The campground had security cameras by the lake. They gave me the footage after Timmy died. I've watched it 10,000 times trying to understand what happened." The small screen came to life, showing a grainy but clear view of the lakefront area where children played in the shallow water. Marcus recognized the scene immediately, the rocky shoreline where families gathered for picnics, the gentle slope down to the water's edge where kids built sand castles and skipped stones. "There," Robert said, pointing to the screen. "That's Timmy playing by himself while I set up our tent." His voice broke slightly. "I was drinking. I'd started drinking again after my wife left, and I thought a camping trip might fix things between us." On the screen, a small boy with Robert's angular features waded into ankle-deep water, chasing minnows with the focused intensity that only 6-year-olds possessed. The video had no sound, but Marcus could imagine Timmy's laughter, his excited calls to his father to come look at what he'd found. "I fell asleep," Robert continued, his confession raw with self-hatred. "Passed out drunk while my son played alone by the water. Watch what happens next." The video showed Timmy venturing deeper into the lake, the water reaching his knees, then his waist. The boy seemed unaware of the danger, focused entirely on something glittering beneath the surface. Then, from the edge of the frame, a golden blur appeared, Duke, racing toward the water with the urgency of a dog who understood that disaster was approaching. "I blamed your dog for 2 years," Robert whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I convinced myself that Duke caused Timmy to fall, that if the dog hadn't interfered, my son would still be alive." On the screen, Duke reached Timmy just as the boy lost his footing on the slick rocks beneath the water. But instead of causing the fall, Duke grabbed Timmy's shirt with his teeth, trying to pull him toward shore. The boy's head struck a partially submerged boulder as he fell, but Duke continued his rescue effort, dragging Timmy's unconscious body to shallow water where other campers could reach him. "Duke saved him," Marcus breathed, understanding flooding through him. "He pulled Timmy out of the water." "He saved him from drowning," Robert confirmed, his voice hollow with 2 years of misdirected rage. "But Timmy hit his head on the rocks and the brain injury. He died 3 days later in the hospital. I needed someone to blame besides myself, so I blamed the dog who actually tried to save my son's life." Emma had been watching from beside Duke's gurney, her 8-year-old mind processing the adult emotions swirling around her. Now she approached Robert with the fearless compassion that children sometimes possess, her small hand reaching toward the photograph pinned to his shirt. "He looks like a nice boy," she said simply. "I bet he would have liked Duke." Robert's composure shattered completely. He knelt down to Emma's eye level, his whole body shaking with sobs that had been building for 2 years. "He loved dogs," Robert managed between gasps. "He wanted a puppy for his birthday. He would have loved Duke so much." Duke, despite his weakness, began struggling to get off the gurney. Sarah moved to restrain him, but the dog's determination was absolute. With effort that clearly cost him, Duke managed to stand and walk the few steps to where Robert knelt beside Emma. The German shepherd sat down carefully, his golden head level with Robert's tear-streaked face, and did something that left everyone in the lobby speechless. Duke licked Robert's cheek, not once, but repeatedly, the gentle kisses that dogs give to pack members who are in distress. There was no fear in the gesture, no hesitation, just pure, unconditional forgiveness from a creature who had every reason to hate the man who'd tortured him. "I'm sorry," Robert whispered into Duke's fur, his arms carefully encircling the dog who should have been his mortal enemy. "I'm so sorry, boy. I know you tried to save him. I've always known, but I couldn't live with the truth." Detective Rodriguez lowered her weapon, recognizing that whatever confrontation she'd been prepared for, this wasn't it. The scene before her was something else entirely, a moment of grace that transformed victims and perpetrators into simply human beings who'd been broken by tragedy and were now, somehow, finding a way to heal. Marcus felt his own anger draining away, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. Watching Robert's grief, seeing the video evidence of Duke's heroism, understanding the depths of a father's self-hatred, it was impossible to maintain hatred for a man who'd been destroyed by the same kind of loss that Marcus himself had barely survived. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her child's voice cutting through the adult complexities with perfect clarity. Robert pulled back from Duke, wiping his eyes with hands that had steadied for the first time in months. "Now I go to jail," he said simply. "I've done terrible things, and I need to pay for them. But first—" He looked at Marcus, then at Duke, then at Emma. "First, I need to make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened at that lake. Your dog isn't a killer. He's a hero. And I'm the one who was too broken to see it." Sarah had been documenting Duke's response to the confrontation, medically fascinated by the dog's behavior. "His stress indicators are actually decreasing," she murmured to Rodriguez. "It's as if seeing Robert, confronting this trauma directly, is helping him heal." As the police prepared to take Robert into custody, he made one final request. Could I see that video of your daughter reading to Duke while he recovered? The one from the news? I want to remember what love looks like when it's not twisted by grief." Emma, with the generosity that children sometimes show to broken adults, took Robert's hand. "I can read to you too, if you want, before you have to go. Duke likes Where the Red Fern Grows best." And so, in the lobby of an animal hospital, surrounded by police officers and medical equipment, a little girl read aloud about the unbreakable bond between children and dogs, while her own dog, still weak from deliberate torture, rested his head in the lap of the man who'd tried to kill him. It was forgiveness in its purest form, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something rare and sacred. The truth about that summer day at Crater Lake changed everything, but it didn't erase the consequences of Robert Fletcher's 2-year descent into vengeful madness. As Detective Rodriguez led him away in handcuffs, Robert looked back one final time at Duke, who watched from his medical gurney with those amber eyes that held no anger, only the profound sadness that dogs seem to carry for human suffering they cannot heal. "I need you to know," Robert said to Marcus as the officers paused at the hospital door. "I watched every moment of his recovery through the news reports. Every night, I sat in that cabin seeing the pictures of your daughter reading to him, watching him get stronger. And every night, I hated myself a little more for what I'd done." Marcus found himself walking alongside Robert toward the police car, Emma's small hand in his, Duke being wheeled beside them by Sarah. It was a strange procession, victim and perpetrator, the tortured and the torturer, moving together toward some kind of resolution that none of them had expected. "The hardest part," Robert continued, his voice barely audible, "was realizing that Duke never stopped being the kind of dog who would have saved Timmy again, even after what I put him through. Even now, looking at me, he's not seeing an enemy. He's seeing someone who needs help." Detective Rodriguez had called for additional units, but the crowds gathering in the hospital parking lot weren't hostile. They were curious, drawn by news reports that had transformed a simple animal cruelty case into something much more complex. Local television crews captured the moment when Robert Fletcher, the man who'd terrorized their community's beloved survivor dog, knelt down one last time to receive Duke's forgiveness. The German shepherd, despite his weakness, stretched his neck toward Robert's hand. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable, a final blessing from the creature who'd suffered most yet forgiven most completely. "I'll testify to everything," Robert told Detective Rodriguez as she opened the patrol car door. "The planning, the torture, all of it. But I also want people to know the truth about that camping trip. I want them to understand that Duke Callahan is a hero, not a killer." As the police car pulled away, Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, why was that man so sad about his little boy?" Marcus knelt down to his daughter's level, searching for words that would help an 8-year-old understand the complexity of grief and guilt and the terrible things people do when they can't forgive themselves. "Sometimes when people lose someone they love very much, they get confused about who to blame. Mr. Fletcher blamed Duke because blaming himself hurt too much. But Duke tried to save the little boy. Yes, sweetheart. Duke tried to save him just like Duke has always tried to save everyone he loves." Sarah had been monitoring Duke's vital signs throughout the confrontation, amazed by the dog's responses. His stress levels actually dropped during the encounter with Robert, she explained to Marcus as they moved back inside the hospital. It's as if confronting his attacker allowed him to process the trauma instead of carrying it. The next several hours brought a parade of visitors that transformed the animal hospital into something resembling a community center. The mayor arrived with a proclamation declaring Duke an honorary citizen of Riverside. The local newspaper editor came to interview Marcus about the case. Children from Emma's school brought handmade cards decorated with crayon drawings of German shepherds. But the most significant visitor was Dr. Patricia Hensley, the trauma counselor Detective Rodriguez had consulted earlier. She'd driven down from Portland specifically to observe Duke's behavior and to offer insight into the psychological aspects of his recovery. "What we're seeing here is remarkable," Dr. Hensley explained to Marcus and Sarah as they watched Duke interact with Emma in the recovery room. "Most animals who've experienced systematic torture develop lasting fear responses, aggression patterns, or withdrawal behaviors. Duke's ability to forgive his attacker suggests an emotional resilience that's almost unprecedented." Emma was teaching Duke to shake hands again, patiently working with him as his strength slowly returned. The dog's tail wagged with something approaching his old enthusiasm, and his eyes had regained their characteristic intelligence and warmth. "Is it possible," Marcus asked, "that Duke understood Robert's pain? That he recognized Robert was acting from grief rather than genuine malice?" Dr. Hensley considered the question carefully. "Dogs are incredibly sensitive to human emotional states. It's possible that Duke sensed Robert's underlying anguish and responded to that rather than to the surface aggression. Animals often see through to the core of human nature in ways that humans themselves cannot." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small convoy of vehicles, news vans from Portland and Seattle, drawn by a story that had captured regional attention. The narrative of Duke's torture and forgiveness, Robert's grief-driven madness and redemption, had struck a chord that reached far beyond their small community. Sarah found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of spokesperson, fielding questions from reporters who wanted to understand how a case of animal cruelty had evolved into something that resembled a parable about the nature of forgiveness. She stood in the hospital lobby, Duke resting calmly beside her, as cameras captured what would become an iconic image, the tortured dog who'd learned to trust again, flanked by the people who'd saved his life. "Duke's recovery isn't just medical," Sarah told the assembled reporters. "What we've witnessed here is proof that love and care can overcome even the most deliberate cruelty. This dog was systematically tortured for months, but his capacity for trust and affection wasn't broken. If anything, it seems to have been strengthened." One reporter asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Will you press charges against Robert Fletcher for the maximum penalties available?" Marcus stepped forward, Emma's hand still in his, and gave an answer that surprised even himself. "We want justice, but we also want healing. Mr. Fletcher is a father who lost his child and made terrible choices because of that loss. Destroying his life won't undo what happened to Duke, and Duke himself has shown us that forgiveness is possible." The statement sparked debate in the comment sections of online news articles and in coffee shops throughout the Pacific Northwest. Some argued that animal cruelty should be punished to the fullest extent of the law, regardless of the perpetrator's motivation. Others saw Marcus's response as a profound example of choosing healing over vengeance. Emma, meanwhile, seemed largely oblivious to the media attention swirling around them. Her focus remained entirely on Duke's continued recovery. She'd established a routine of visiting the hospital after school, doing her homework in the recovery room while Duke rested nearby, reading to him during his physical therapy sessions. "He remembers everything," she told her father one evening, as they walked Duke slowly around the hospital's exercise yard. "All our games, all our walks, everything we used to do together. The bad man didn't take any of that away. Duke's progress continued to exceed medical expectations. By the end of the week, he was strong enough to climb stairs. His appetite had returned to normal, and his coat was showing healthy regrowth in the areas damaged by tick infestation. More importantly, his psychological recovery seemed complete. He showed no fear of strangers, no aggressive responses to sudden movements, no signs of the trauma that should have left lasting scars. Dr. Patricia Hensley returned for a follow-up evaluation, bringing with her a team of veterinary behaviorists who wanted to study Duke's remarkable resilience. Their preliminary findings suggested that Duke's extraordinary recovery was linked to the strength of his bond with Emma and Marcus. The dog's love for his family had provided an anchor that prevented trauma from overwhelming his psyche. In human psychology, we call this post-traumatic growth. Dr. Hensley explained during a consultation with Marcus and Sarah, some individuals not only recover from trauma, but actually become stronger and more resilient as a result of overcoming it. Duke appears to be demonstrating the same phenomenon. The legal proceedings against Robert Fletcher moved forward with unusual cooperation from all parties. Robert pled guilty to animal cruelty charges and accepted responsibility for his actions without attempting to minimize their severity. But Marcus's public statements about forgiveness, combined with evidence of Robert's genuine remorse and mental health struggles, influenced the judge's sentencing decision. Robert received 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months, along with mandatory counseling for grief and alcohol abuse. He would also be required to pay restitution for Duke's medical expenses and to perform community service at animal shelters upon his release. Justice doesn't always mean maximum punishment, the judge explained during sentencing. Sometimes it means creating opportunities for genuine redemption and healing for everyone involved. The courtroom was packed with community members who'd followed the case, many of them bringing their own dogs as a show of support for Duke. Emma sat in the front row with Duke beside her. The dog had been deemed emotionally stable enough to attend the proceedings that would formally close this chapter of their lives. When Robert was led away to begin his sentence, he paused to look one final time at Duke. The dog's tail wagged slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both forgiveness and farewell. It was, observers noted, a moment of grace that transformed what could have been a story of pure victimization into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. As they left the courthouse, Marcus carried with him a letter that Robert had written to Emma, an apology and explanation that she could read when she was older, when she could better understand the complicated ways that grief can twist love into something destructive. "The bad man isn't bad anymore," Emma announced as they walked toward their car, Duke trotting beside them with something approaching his old confidence and joy. "He's just sad, and now he's going to learn how to be sad without hurting anyone." It was, Marcus realized, possibly the wisest thing anyone had said about the entire ordeal. 6 months later, spring arrived in Riverside with an abundance that felt like the town itself was celebrating. The dogwood trees that lined Maple Street bloomed with unusual profusion, and the community gardens that had struggled through years of drought suddenly flourished with vegetables and flowers that seemed to grow overnight. It was as if Duke's recovery had somehow blessed the entire town with renewed life. The Chen family's morning routine had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and transformed. Emma would wake first, padding downstairs in her pajamas to find Duke waiting by the back door, his tail wagging with the patient enthusiasm of a dog who understood that good things come to those who wait. Marcus would join them in the kitchen, brewing coffee while Duke and Emma performed their morning ritual of checking the backyard for any overnight visitors, squirrels, rabbits, or the occasional deer that wandered down from the hills. Duke's physical recovery had been complete for months, but the deeper healing continued in ways that surprised everyone who'd followed his story. Dr. Sarah Martinez had documented his progress in a case study that was being published in veterinary journals across the country, not just for the medical aspects of his treatment, but for the psychological resilience he'd demonstrated. "He's become a different dog," Sarah told Marcus during one of Duke's regular checkups. "Not worse or better than before, just deeper somehow, as if the experience taught him something about the complexity of human nature that most animals never learn." It was true. Duke had always been intelligent and intuitive, but now he possessed an almost mystical ability to sense when people were struggling with pain or loss. Children gravitated toward him at the park, drawn by some quality they couldn't name but instinctively trusted. Elderly visitors to the animal hospital specifically requested to spend time with Duke, finding comfort in his calm presence that seemed to understand suffering without being diminished by it. The most remarkable change had come in Emma herself. Her anxiety, which had plagued her since her mother's death, had transformed into something that could only be described as wisdom. She'd become the child other children turned to when they were scared or sad, possessing an intuitive understanding of how to offer comfort without overwhelming someone with false cheerfulness. "Duke taught me that being hurt doesn't make you broken," she explained to her father one evening as they watched the dog play with a neighbor's puppy in their backyard. "It just makes you understand better when other people are hurting too." Marcus had returned to work full-time, his software engineering projects taking on new meaning as he developed applications for animal shelters and veterinary clinics. The experience of nearly losing Duke had crystallized something in his priorities. He wanted his work to matter, to contribute to the kind of community support system that had saved his family during their darkest hours. The financial donations that had poured in during Duke's crisis had not only covered his medical expenses, but had funded the establishment of the Duke Callahan Foundation for Animal Crisis Care. Sarah served as the medical director, using the funds to provide emergency veterinary care for families who couldn't afford life-saving treatment for their pets. "Every animal deserves what Duke received," Sarah had said during the foundation's inaugural ceremony. "A community that rallies around them, medical care that doesn't depend on their owner's bank account, and the understanding that the bond between humans and animals is sacred." The Foundation's first major case had been a cat named Whiskers, whose elderly owner had been forced to choose between her own prescription medications and cancer treatment for her pet. The Foundation covered Whiskers' chemotherapy, and the cat's complete recovery had provided the kind of success story that attracted additional donors and volunteers. Robert Fletcher had been released from prison after serving 18 months of his sentence, his good behavior and genuine remorse earning him early parole. He'd emerged from incarceration fundamentally changed, sober for the first time in years, having worked through his grief with intensive counseling, and carrying a letter of recommendation from the prison's animal therapy program where he'd worked with rescue dogs. His first stop upon release had been the animal hospital, where he'd asked to speak with Marcus and Emma. The meeting had been arranged carefully, with Dr. Hensley present to facilitate and ensure everyone's emotional safety. "I wanted to thank you," Robert had said, his voice steady but humble, "not just for forgiving me, but for showing me what love actually looks like. Watching your family's response to what I did, seeing how you chose healing over hatred, it saved my life as much as it saved Duke's." Emma, now 9 years old and possessed of the kind of confidence that comes from having survived real trauma, had listened to Robert's apology with the serious attention she gave to all important conversations. When he finished speaking, she'd asked the question that cut straight to the heart of things. "Do you miss your little boy less now?" Robert's eyes had filled with tears, but they were different tears than the bitter, self-destructive grief that had consumed him before. "I miss him the same amount," he'd answered honestly, "but now I can remember him without hating myself. I can love his memory without destroying everything else I touch." Duke's reaction to seeing Robert again had been characteristically generous. The dog had approached without hesitation, offering the same gentle presence he gave to anyone who carried pain. There was no fear, no aggression, just the profound acceptance that seemed to be Duke's greatest gift. Robert now worked at an animal sanctuary outside Portland, his experience with grief and recovery making him particularly effective with traumatized rescue animals. He sent updates occasionally, photos of dogs he'd helped rehabilitate, stories of successful adoptions, small evidence that his life had found meaning beyond the tragedy that had nearly destroyed him. The camping trip to Crater Lake had been Emma's idea. "I want to see where Timmy played," she'd said simply. "I want Duke to know that place can be happy again." They'd reserved the same campsite where the tragedy had occurred 2 years earlier, and Marcus had felt his chest tighten as they drove through the familiar landscape. But Emma's excitement was infectious, and Duke's tail had started wagging as soon as they'd turned into the campground, as if he recognized the scents and sounds of a place where he'd once been a hero. The weekend had been perfect. Clear skies, gentle breezes, and the kind of peaceful family time that felt like a gift rather than something to be taken for granted. Duke had played in the same shallow water where he'd once saved a drowning child, his joyful splashing a testament to his ability to hold both tragedy and happiness in the same space. On their final morning, as they packed up their tent and prepared to return home, Emma had insisted on visiting the exact spot where Timmy had fallen. She'd brought wildflowers picked from their own garden, and she'd placed them carefully on the rocky shore while Duke sat beside her in respectful silence. "I think he would have liked Duke," she'd said, her 9-year-old voice carrying the kind of certainty that adults spend lifetimes trying to reclaim. Marcus had watched his daughter and his dog standing together by the water's edge, both of them changed by trauma, but not broken by it. Both of them proof that love can survive even the worst that life can offer. The morning sun had turned the lake's surface into a mirror that reflected not just their images, but their capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and hope. As we reach the golden years of our lives, we often wonder if our capacity for hope diminishes with time, if the wounds we've carried become too heavy to heal. Duke's story reminds us that it's never too late for redemption, never too late to choose love over bitterness. Like many of us who've weathered decades of loss, spouses, friends, dreams that didn't come true, Robert Fletcher learned that grief can either poison our remaining years or transform us into vessels of grace. At 52, broken by guilt and consumed by rage, he discovered what we all need to remember. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the pain, it's about refusing to let that pain define our legacy. Duke, tortured for months, yet still capable of trust, shows us that resilience isn't about avoiding suffering. It's about letting love be stronger than the hurt. Emma, at 9 years old, understood what takes some of us 70 years to learn. Broken doesn't mean worthless, and the deepest scars often create the most beautiful capacity for compassion. In our autumn seasons, when the world tells us our best days are behind us, Duke's story whispers a different truth, that every sunrise offers another chance to choose healing over hatred, connection over isolation. Discussion questions. What moment of unexpected forgiveness in your own life taught you the most about healing? How has your relationship with a beloved pet helped you through your most difficult seasons? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.